On this episode of China Uncensored, it turns out that lending money to strangers on the internet can be kind of risky. Hi, welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. It's scarier than Jurassic Park, more terrifying than Jaws, and way more serious than the Meg. It's the peer-to-peer loan crisis in China, and it's worse than Jason Statham trying to stretch his acting range. P2p lending is also called crowd lending. It's one part of China's shadow banking industry, a kind of parallel dimension of debt financing that conjures up images of back-alley loan sharks. Shadow banking is all the lending and borrowing that's done outside the highly regulated banking industry. And in China, shadow banking is big business. It includes everything from high-risk exotic investment products to pawn shop and loan shark operations to online peer-to-peer loans. Shadow banking has been crucial to China's economy because it provides much-needed loans to small businesses and individuals that might not qualify for regular bank loans. Local governments have even used shadow banking loans to make up shortfalls. Shadow banking in China is a $10 trillion a year industry. This slice, about 9%, is the crowd lending sector. The P2p lending may seem like a small slice, but there's more P2p lending in China than everywhere else in the world combined. It's got 50 million registered users and outstanding loans of around $200 billion. P2p lending is a bit like Tinder, but instead of going on a date with a stranger, you enter into a financial partnership with a stranger. And in both cases, if the person has face tattoos, swipe left. Okay, seriously, P2p lending is less like Tinder and more like Kickstarter. Only instead of funding a company and getting an underwater drone or a high-tech water gun or a giant Lionel Richie head, instead of a product, you fund a company and earn interest from your loan after a certain period of time. By cutting out the bank as the middleman, crowd lending platforms promise high returns to lenders and cheaper loans to borrowers. Some platforms promised as much as 12% return, which is way higher than you could get from anywhere else. Win-win, it would seem, except that these platforms have spread like wildfire pretty much without any regulatory oversight, and a lot of times the loans are risky. Like, you might think you're funding the underwater drone when it turns out you're actually funding the giant Lionel Richie head, and there's no way to pull your money out. And a lot of times, lenders don't get paid back. Also, the lack of oversight means that even P2p companies themselves can cheat investors over a long period of time. For example, Yizhubao. It was once the golden child of P2p lending in China, but it was shut down in 2016 after cheating investors out of $7.6 billion in an elaborate Ponzi scheme. How elaborate? Well, according to the New York Times, Yizhubao duped about 1 million investors by offering fake investment products. And to hide their trail, the bosses buried 1,200 documents in 80 bags 20 feet underground that took police a whole day to dig up with 2 excavators. That's crazy. Did no one tell them about paper shredders or bonfires? And it goes way beyond just peer-to-peer lending. The entire shadow banking sector in China has been gripped by a regulatory shakedown in order to reduce leverage, curb crazy levels of risk, and hopefully prevent a financial meltdown. Since regulators took P2p lending into their crosshairs, these platforms have started dropping like flies. According to the South China Morning Post, the total number of P2p lending platforms that have failed is over 4,500, with more than 200 in July alone. Yes, there are more than 4,000 lending companies that have failed, taking people's money down with them. The head of the Shenzhen Internet Financial Association warns that the industry might enter a great recession. Everybody's on edge, he says, as some companies shut down because of bad loans, fraud, or asset freezes by inspectors. A total of 165 lending platforms stopped allowing investor withdrawals in July, locking up tens of billions of dollars in capital. On top of that, hundreds of P2p lending platform owners have simply run away with investors' money. So obviously, a lot of people are upset. They want the government to bail them out, or to hold the companies accountable. But in the government's view, it's the investor's own fault. people knew it was risky and invested their money anyway. Besides, government bailouts are only for rich corporations that are too big to fail. So a lot of angry people decided to undermine China's harmonious society by traveling to Beijing to petition the appropriate government office. Don't see any protesters? That's because no protests took place.
Last Monday, many wanted to demand a P2p bailout from the government and organise themselves online. However, any challenge to stability is sensitive in China. Those who made it to the protest area were detained. An investor told Reuters this video shows they were forced onto buses and carted away to a holding centre.
Some petitioners didn't even make it all the way to Beijing. According to Reuters, many would-be protesters were removed from Beijing-bound trains ahead of the protests, forced to give fingerprints and even blood samples. Turns out, it's not just the banks that are the bloodsuckers in this story. Now, to be fair, Chinese authorities didn't only crack down on investors who lost their life savings. They also cracked down on people who borrowed money and had trouble paying back their P2p loans. Authorities put them on a social credit rating blacklist. It's just one of the 10 delightful new measures China's regulators have come up with to minimize risk and to make sure that no one goes unpunished. Other measures include strictly banning local authorities from allowing any new P2p lending platforms to be set up, and setting up so-called communication windows where people who've lost money can vent their grievances outside the public eye, where someone with no power to help them can pretend to listen. Now, it's good that the Chinese government is finally trying to regulate this P2p lending industry. But as for the individual investors who have already lost their life savings, they now understand just how the Chinese Communist Party maintains stability. There's a serious financial problem that threatens the livelihoods of millions of people, but instead of allowing protests, they figure out a way to keep protesters quiet and sweep the whole thing under the rug. Or under the giant Lionel Richie head. So what do you think? Should China bail out P2p lenders? And what do you think about China's clamping down on protesters? And what's the weirdest Kickstarter you've ever funded? Leave your comments below. And before we go, it's time for a question from one of our fans who supports China Uncensored on Patreon. James Kelton asks, is there anything happening in China at the moment that isn't a prelude to the apocalypse? It all seems rather gloomy of late. Nope, it's all gloom and doom. Sorry, James. I'm just kidding. There are good things happening in China. For example, in northern China, there's a project underway to turn desert into arable farmland. Although the part they leave out is how 7 decades of bad environmental policy resulted in massive desertification. So yes, there are good things, but I generally don't tell you about them on China Uncensored since Chinese state-run media is doing a perfectly good job of that. China Uncensored is here to tell you about the things state-run media keeps censored, and those are not the positive things. Thanks for your question, James. And for everyone else watching, China Uncensored relies on viewer support. So click the link below to visit us on the crowdfunding website Patreon and contribute $1 or more per episode. And I might answer your question next. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored. Click the orange button to visit patreon.com. If you can, support China Uncensored. You'll get all sorts of cool perks, and of course, you'll be making a huge difference for the show. Click here.